I grew up in New York City, and when I was small, we used to call this building the haunted house.
Later, I learned that it really was a haunted house. For as long as I could remember, the second floor of the building had a big display window where a dusty white tuxedo stood under a broken neon sign that said dress suits for hire. The I and T of suits hung at an angle. Sometimes an old woman would sweep the sidewalk outside and glare at you. But let's back up, about 100 years. In 1887, 84 Second Avenue was the address of Temporary Home for Females. This was where Nellie Bly began her career as an investigative journalist. Unhappy with covering fashion and high society, Nellie left her job at the Pittsburgh Dispatch. After 4 months of rejection by editors who would not hire a woman, she managed to get an interview with the managing editor of The World. She pitched the idea of traveling by third-class steerage and reporting the conditions. The editor thought she was too inexperienced for this, but he proposed a different idea. Blackwell Island is now called Roosevelt Island, and it's a tiny sliver of land in between Manhattan and the Queens mainland. Once upon a time, it was where the Murekowik group of Lenape natives would come and fish. But by the time Nellie Bly was born, the island was where New York stashed the poor, the sick, and the criminal. A total of 11 public buildings were on the island, including a prison, a workhouse, and a smallpox hospital, which is now abandoned and looks like this. Spooky. There was also an asylum for poor women, which was abandoned in the 1960s and is now a fancy condo building. Nellie figured that the best way to get locked up on Blackwell Island was to check in to a boarding house with no money under an assumed name and stage a fit. Accordingly, she looked in a directory and selected Temporary Home for Females at 84 Second Avenue. After checking herself in, she stayed up all night, being super weird and scaring the hell out of all the women in the boarding house. The next morning, she was escorted out of the boarding house and sent to Blackwell Island. 10 days later, The World secured her release. Her resulting expose caused a sensation and led to a grand jury investigation of mental hospitals. The boarding house where Nellie Bly got herself committed to an insane asylum was demolished in 1909, and a new building was erected on the lot. Here it is in the 1940s when there was a millinery on the ground floor and everyone on Second Avenue was Jewish. By 1970, the Department of Buildings shows that 84 Second Avenue was owned by the Sapolsky family. And then in 1974, a terrible tragedy was reported in the New York Times. For the next 35 years, the tuxedo shop was frozen in time. Betty Sapolsky died in 2010, and the building was sold for $5 million in 2016. Now there's a tapas restaurant here with flamenco dancing.